It's all about learning. Okay, I understand it's being recorded, so that's good. So these workshops will kind of test those models, and we will be learning by doing with all these stakeholders together, looking at real assets and having a real discussion about some of the solutions there. And they will be focusing on the role of real-world evidence in the area of outcomes-based managed entry agreements. That's the terminology that we use. I mean, you may well use the managed access in the Canadian context, but I think they kind of are more or less in the same direction. The second work stream will be a series of webinars, just like this one, where we had a first webinar with European Medicines Agency on this Darwin EU system that's being built. And then the last work stream is around the advocacy, because obviously the creation of that learning network also is one of the objectives, but also the stakeholders obviously want to have a say in the policy debate, and the creation of European health data space, which is very much happening as we speak. There has also been some recommendations from this initiative going to that, and some advocacy happening in that space. So maybe in conclusion, some thoughts to kind of hopefully inspire the rest of the debate in terms of the learnings that we've had so far in Europe, and I think some of the elements that we still need to work on. And that's my final slide on the last. I think we've been able to, with some of these initiatives, to speak more the same language between different stakeholders and create more trust. With that taxonomy, work on a common framework and language, and also work on some tools to manage uncertainties and reduce risk. I think that matching access with risk and reduce uncertainties has really been helpful with that framework. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to be done also back in Europe. As I mentioned, European health data space is really in its infancy, and I think should be really a facilitator of getting these accessible and interoperable data sets. I also think in Europe, there's a strong role, future role, potential role for the European reference networks that were built 5 years ago now for these 24 rare disease areas. But still, I think needs some more teeth and meat to the bone to be able to fulfill their role also in this aspect. And then I think back to our topic on access, I think we're still far away from a functioning value-based or outcomes-based framework also in Europe. I mean, you see that there is definitely a role for these outcomes-based managed entry agreements, but it's still very varying in terms of the readiness of some of the countries in Europe of implementing these. And we've seen some first kind of attempts to do something also in the rare disease space with the Scottish scheme and with the Dutch scheme. So there are some positive developments, but I think still a long way to go. And with that, I would like to conclude, Durhan, and I hope that has kind of set a bit the scene, and looking forward to discussion.
Thank you so much, Toon. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who's going to take us through that first panel. That was a brilliant introduction, I think, to the certainly an overview of the topic, where the Europeans are. Most exciting thing was to recognize that CADIS, of course, is part of this collaboration, as you've said. So we'll turn it over and ask that those panelists in that first panel to turn on their screens and unmute themselves. And I'm going to hand it over to Bill.
Thanks so much, Durhan and Toon. That was fantastic. My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs, and I'm often called on to help direct traffic on conversations like this. It's so great to see a bridge between Europe and Canada and UCAN. Maybe one of the reasons why Canada is part of that grouping is that our structure here is similar to that of Europe. We're like a mini Europe. We have a federal regulator in terms of Health Canada, and then almost all health spending and decisions are made in the provinces and by the provinces. And that's why I think a lot of what you said in terms of building trust at that framework level, the national level, or I guess in Europe it would be supranational level, really does resonate with folks. And I'd love to hear some of the reactions from the Canadians to what Toon presented. So just to quickly introduce the first panel, we've got until about 1:45. We've got Dr. Leanne Ward, professor and medical director of the CHEO Bone Health Clinic right here in Ottawa, and scientific director of the Ottawa Pediatric Bone Health Research Group, and a regular contributor to these webinars with Cord. So thank you, Leanne, for joining us. We've also got Peter Brenders, general manager for Canada at BeiGene, and many people you don't need much more of an introduction than that to say that welcome back to Cord Events under this new title and the new ship of BeiGene here in Canada. Peter, great to see you again. Sandra Anderson, Senior Vice President of Commercialization and Strategy at Innomar Strategies. Again, Sandra, you're very involved in helping coordinate a lot of Cord's multi-stakeholder group to get ready to what can Canada do on the federal, national, and whatnot in rare diseases. So thank you, Sandra, for joining us. We've got Bob McClay, Vice President and General Manager at SOBI Canada, also Chair of Rare Eye, the Canadian Forum for Rare Disease Innovators. Welcome, Bob. Thanks for joining. And last but certainly not least, and Jackie, it's great to see you again. I always told you my mom had angioedema, and it was the most frightening thing in the world. And I've worked with you a long time ago, but this is where really the rubber hits the road, and that's with patients. And so Jackie is the president of the Hereditary Angioedema Canada. So thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us. So with that, I'm going to throw out the first question, and we're not going to go one by one. And again, to Durhan's point, really encouraging the participants to jump in using the chat function. But after listening to Toon, which one of the panelists wants to begin in terms of, are there examples of managed access programs in Canada that you're aware of? And can they work here? Was there something from Toon's presentation that really, resonated with you? Maybe we'll start with some of the industry leaders on the line who are on the other side of these discussions to actually bring them together. I don't know if Bob or Peter, you want to kick it off?
Sure, I could give probably as the old guy in the crowd here, just sort of, I can think back, and it's funny when Duran asked me, I'd look back and I was thinking about Fabry, and so not wearing the BeiGene hat, but wearing my old Genzyme hat. And good gracious, that's almost 20 years ago when we first brought a treatment for Fabry disease to Canada, and might have been sort of, I think, the country's first concerted managed access program, as they created the Canadian Fabry Disease Initiative, a trial of sorts, more of an observational study. And I think it was put in place at the time to answer questions. Like at the time when a treatment for Fabry disease came out, it was still the world of shock and awe. Like, well, A, there were rare diseases and there was no appreciation on that. And then B, treatments for rare diseases were so outside of the normal scope. And so I think that was the big challenge that the payers faced more than anything else. And so even though you had a Health Canada approval that these products were safe and effective, there were payer questions in terms of, and honestly, the first question was, do we really need to treat these patients? And do we need to treat them now, and can we wait? And so that's where the observational study came into play, where basically it was a combination of the payer, the clinicians, and the industry all coming together to come up with some data. And I think it was used very well in the beginning. It led to patient access to care, but I think as the evidence sort of came in over the first couple of years, and it's like, yep, it makes a difference as it changes the course of the outcomes. No one ever looked back again. Like the study went through, and I don't think there were ever any final reports or any publications other than the first year. So it was almost one of those ones just to help to get it in. And so if that's what it takes to get patients to care, then so be it. But it was a cumbersome process, if I recall.
Yeah, Peter, it's interesting. I've been in the rare disease space for the last 5.5 years, and Fabry comes up almost as the example. And it's kind of disheartening that was 20 years ago, and we don't have a better example than that. So, again, in doing this, it's not like there's a nice, simple, easy mechanism. It's not like let's sit down with all those at the table to talk about a managed access program. it's really hard to navigate. I'm sure when you did that, it would have been extremely difficult. And as you say, people shock and awe didn't know how to deal with this. And I don't know that we do. It was really interesting hearing Toon talk. I didn't hear him use the word price or cost once in his discussion. And that was really refreshing, that it was really evidence, science, collaboration, multi-stakeholder decision making. That to me is the ideal where we want to get to. And I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah. Sandra, I don't know if you want to jump in. You've got some experience on many files over the last, I won't say how many years, but we've been at it about the same amount of time, Sandra. So over to you.
Yeah, I think that there's a few examples, and I know that they're not formally, the way Toon described managed access programs, but there's ways we've been able to track outcomes for a number of specialty drugs. The two examples that come to mind, and I know we're going to talk more about them, but patient support programs, right? This is a model that manufacturers sponsor. Obviously, all specialty drugs, including rare, have these types of programs, but they do collect a lot of data. And most recently, in the last few years, specifically for the rare disease drugs, we have been collecting a lot of evidence that are leveraged for market access purposes. So although they're not intended to design that way, they are collecting a lot of evidence that can support whether it's a product listing agreement, an outcomes measurement. And right now they're siloed, they're manufactured, they're drug specific. But another example that comes to mind, which is more on the payer side, which is about 8 years ago, is the Health Forward model, which works with a number of private payers. Again, not necessarily for rare diseases, but they're also tracking outcomes. They're trying to get the right patient, the right drug at the right time, and they're trying to manage costs. But they are looking at it from a health outcomes perspective, where patients are enrolled, they're tracked, and then the data is collected to help them make informed decisions of whether to continue funding the drug. So it's based on outcomes. So those are models that come to mind. I think that there's obviously pros and cons to each of them, but there's ways we can take those models, and I think there's further opportunity to centralize and build it as part of the rare disease strategy.
Thanks so much. Dr. Ward, where's the clinician's role in this? And what resonated from Toon's discussion and what you've heard so far? Are you ready to actually, collect outcomes and play a role? Have you been doing this all along already? And what are some of the gaps from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for the dialogue. So I should just first explain where I come to the table from. I have been involved in caring for children with hypophosphatasia, which spans life-threatening to mild, and aspartame alpha saves lives. And I have witnessed that unfold over the years, and I've been involved in the study and care of children with X-linked hypophosphatemia, and Varosumab. And what I'm seeing is the following. So first of all, I'm seeing that when health authorities evaluate the evidence that arises from the studies, they often then link the reimbursement to the trial conditions that led to the success of the drug, but the trial conditions do not necessarily cover the broader spectrum of patients that could benefit from the drug. So I think there's a need in terms of study design and thinking about the very long term and working to get patients on drug who would ultimately benefit from it, even if they didn't meet the very specific trial conditions. And then the other thing that I'm taking part in that's teaching me a lot is a phase 4 trial. In this case, it's in X-linked hypophosphatemia, and it's a 10-year study. And I think it very much addresses what's being talked about today, this very long-term vision of trying to address the questions that were raised by the health authorities in their review of the drug in order to understand over the longer term the full spectrum of the impact. Now, these are very costly studies, but they're very worthwhile, and we're learning all kinds of information about health outcomes over the longer term on specialized medicines on a broader range of patients than those who were originally targeted for the, say, phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So that's an example of really going after those outcomes that we need to understand in more detail. And I very much applaud that approach.
That's terrific. Thanks, Leanne. And it's a good bridge actually to Jackie. Several people, including Toon, have talked about what do we measure and how do we measure it. And I know Jackie, HA Canada has done incredible work on expressing what it means to a patient, or what are the expectations from the patient with a rare disorder. What's been your experience or thoughts on where the patient organization fits in helping collect and present, that patient and caregiver experience that can actually help move these forward?
Hi, Bill. Thanks for this. I guess where I first started learning was the first time I had to do a patient submission with you, and we had 6 weeks to prepare and get it ready. And I went, I never want to be caught like that in 6 weeks. You did an amazing job. We did a questionnaire. I built on that. And that was what I think almost 12 years ago now. And since then, what I learned to do is just regular national report cards. I just learned to continue gathering data all the way through with the membership and the true patient voice. It's a lot of the questions that are not always gathered, but when candidates ask the questions for our patient submissions, we are ready. We're ready to speak about the true psychosocial issues that are really faced with the quality of life. If people don't get access to treatment, we have very different varying treatments and different voices and different needs and different types of HAE. So this has really garnered a lot of information, and we have different access depending on which programs, which province, whether we're in the CBS program or if we're in the drug program. So it's been complicated, but gathering data all the time throughout, and it's predominantly by phoning, speaking to the members, the 514. So when we tell them we need them to fill out a certain survey for a certain way, we usually can get at least 140 in a week filling out what we need and to hear all across Canada. And I think that's what's been the most important, is the true patient voice. Every time we do one of these things, I am surprised by what they are saying. So it's the true voice. It's exactly whether or not they're well and what they need.
That's really, well, considering you can get that done in a week, then 6 weeks would be easy next time, right, Jackie?
Yes.
I want to bring it back over to Europe really briefly, too. If one thing that, and this is something that Durhan has presented on many times, this is what we say in terms of what the patients say. And then this is what we heard. And they turn a lot of what the patient and the caregiver experience is into a very clinical or economic perspective. And it ends up being, categorized or measured very differently by people in expert panels. And it was great that you've got Karen Facey involved and others, because I think that people like that are expert interpreters. How are you managing that in Europe? Is that even an issue there, where some of the expert committees are, looking for one thing? And I picked up on something that Leanne said, Dr. Ward said as well, that, the clinical trial experience and data and criteria may actually be different than what patients can expect or want in the real world, especially when we need it quickly. Because that's what, Peter, you said early. It's like, how do we get access to Fabry's patients early? We can't wait any longer. And that's, I think, a real issue here in Canada. I don't know, Toon, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think to your question about maybe more broader about patient involvement, patient engagement in terms of some of these expert review committees, that yes, I think some of Karen's work is definitely kind of alluding to more need of that kind of inclusive approach and real, not just tick the box exercise as you sometimes see. And I think from the payer perspective, I think there's still some way to go in Europe. I think you do see very varying approaches to that, and some, still a lot of payers, I would say, see it more as a tick the box exercise in terms of real true patient engagements in some of these appraisals and reviews. I think maybe a model to look at more from the regulator side is how EMA has been, I think, trying to find a more structured way of patient engagement in the regulatory process. I think they've come already a long way of more structured through engagement with patient organizations as part of the regulatory review. So I think that's maybe the way and where we should be heading towards in the future, also from the payer side.
Anyone else want to jump in and Go for it, Peter.
Yeah, I do. I guess I'm a little more cynical. Surprise on this one. I mean, having looked back at the Fabry and the exercise and then the lack of complete attention to the results that came out of it tells me a lot of this great example was just a facade. And I think, so the question is, why do we need real world evidence out there as it relates to access, for patient access, and the question, and what were the questions? And I get at the time of Fabry that rare disease treatments were extremely rare and it was something new and it was there. But at the end of the day, it was really more, and it felt more like a stall than actual, really, we need some evidence to help justify sort of that we're going to support this one. Because at the end, they do. But it comes down to the question. So if we're going to come up with a real world evidence requirement before we provide this treatment out there, then it raises fundamental questions in terms of what's Health Canada actually doing in terms of when it says it's safe and effective. It comes down to, what does the payer need? Well, there's a risk opportunity there to sit down with the company and sort of say, look, I get you have some questions, but treat your patients now and let's collect the data as we go, as opposed to going through, because that exercise to get the CFDI set up was a long and excruciatingly difficult exercise. And I can imagine so many other studies, and you can imagine every ethics review board you're going to go through. It's going to take months and months and months. And if you have an aggressive disease, how does that help anyone? It doesn't. It's going to put the pressure on the companies as well. You should give it free for the time being. And I remember conversations with the government is, why should we give it free? You're the health system. Well, the patients need it. I'm like, well, if you've already decided, government, that the patients need it, then why aren't you treating them? And then there's no answer to that. And so I would have been happy to sort of say, look, we'll look after these patients and we'll support them now, but then you pay for it back from the day one if the results are positive. And they struggled on that one. And I think there's a question is like, and if it doesn't work, I would say, fine, you know what, we give a remit, we'll eat that cost. But we knew, because we had the evidence out there, that it made a difference in patients' lives. But where's the partnership in all this? And, as the opportunity to have these discussions way before the product even gets licensed in Canada. Can we get the bandwidth there? So there are lots of things it comes down to. And the question is, what do we want it for? What purpose is? And too much of it seems to be just to allow the payer to buy some time. Well, there's other ways to address that.
Well, Peter, if I may maybe just quickly react to that. I think, Peter, that's exactly the model that I referred to in the end that has been kind of evolving in the Netherlands and in Scotland, is exactly that. It's kind of coverage with evidence development, I would say, that you make it available and then you kind of collect the data and kind of reassess 2-3 years down the line to look at some of the outcomes. That's exactly what has been looked at. Back to your example.
Thanks, June. Jackie, you had your hand up?
Yes, I have some great examples that we've been doing through Canada with the different products. And there's been lots of special access for products with the hereditary angioedema world. And it's been like the different companies have given it complimentary. We have others that it's been approved for type 1 and 2. And yet through CBS, they've been treating the type 3s all the way through and collecting the evidence. And now we're starting clinical trials in Canada. The first set of clinical trials for HAE with normal here in Canada at the same time globally, because of the time that the CBS took to treat a population and collect the evidence with us, with the patient organization. And also with Takeda here in Canada, actually, we have great, it used to be Shire Takeda with the Firazyr, which was acute, which was done very similarly, and now access is there. And now with the Lanudalimab, I'm going to the provinces, and it's not taking very long this time because they're all the same people, and we've worked with them collaboratively in the past. And now this product is coming in quite well. So I feel that and the candidate assessments and the expert committee there did speak to me directly about the psychosocial impact on the patients and really took that to heart when they're making their decisions. I feel we've had great improvements in the last while, and I'm really excited about this next rare disease strategy that we're going to do. And I think Cord was very instrumental in a lot of these parts of being such a successful navigation in Canada here.
And I see even the skeptic on the panel, Peter, you're nodding your head there. Sandra, you had your hand up. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think, and I agree, there's some comments that I certainly agree with. To address the uncertainty, we do have examples where we have been able to, manufacturers have been able to negotiate almost a conditional reimbursement agreement where if they meet certain outcomes, then the drug is paid for. I'm not saying that's the solution, but there are many examples in the rare disease space where we have tracked the data, and the manufacturer takes on risk, pays for it, and if it meets, then the payer pays. So I'm not saying that's the solution. I think that there's a better model, and I agree with Jackie. Cord has come up with some great ideas recently in the rare disease consultation, where the idea is to create a central, governance model where we're able to have a review, right, with the clinician and the manufacturer and the payer at the same table, all kind of sharing the risk, agreeing on the criteria, and each coming to the table. And again, tracking the outcomes, collecting them. I think the challenge right now is we have these different examples, they're one-offs, but there's no central way. And I think it was great to see that there's a recognition rare disease is different. We just had those rare disease consultations. I know there's a lot more to do, but I think there's a way to centralize this and have a framework. Every rare molecule is different. They'll all have different criteria, all different outcomes. But if we can get the government to play and work with industry, I think there's a huge opportunity to actually legitimize the model and have a different pathway for rare disease.
And Sandra, just really quickly following up on that, I mean, you talk to companies well in advance of even coming to Canada sometimes. When is the best time to actually start these discussions? How long would a typical managed access program last? I mean, COVID's a great example. I mean, we're now making, major decisions based on, 800-person trials on potentially, switching therapies in the UK and rolling reviews at Health Canada. It seems like a lot of these evaluations have sped up for COVID. Should we do something that actually gets these out the door faster, and when should they happen?
Definitely during the Health Canada registration time, or even before when designing the trials. We are speaking to customers even earlier now, especially as there's an opportunity to have regulatory and CADTH work together through the R2D2 process, or even just how to position the regulatory filing is the time, not later when you're building your CADTH submission. So I think that there's a regulatory strategy to build real world evidence and then have the opportunity to bring in the CADTH discussion. And I agree, Bill, ideally, right now it's one after the other. The ideal managed access is at the same time. Get the drug into the Canada and then monitor evidence, because the trials right now, the way that they're designed, are not for rare disease. You cannot design them the same way as a regular drug, and that's the whole issue. So they should be done at the same time. And you can call it conditional access. You can call it coverage with evidence. There's different ways. I know Toon described different models, but European countries are doing it. Germany, France are doing it. They're getting the drug approved and then they're monitoring how the drug performs in the real world. This is the same thing. It's just right now it's not organized that way to physically collect the data. And I think that's the opportunity right now in the rare disease consultations we're having with Health Canada. Let's do it sooner. Let's start that journey sooner and get patients on drug, and then have them mandate that they, we collect the evidence and we keep it going. To your question on long term, I think that there should be criteria negotiated, whether it's stop-start criteria, discontinuation criteria. As long as the patient meets the endpoint that's been negotiated and it's tracked over time, I think that it can be implemented, and it's almost like a long-term study, the way Leanne described it.
So we've looked at when they should happen, a little bit about how they should happen, and I picked that up from Toon. There was the trust for rare, like that sounds like a little bit of a clearinghouse. One of the questions that came in on the chat was who monitors that. And then we can talk about that, but I wanted to maybe turn to Bob. You've got some experience with one or two patients in Canada who need it, and yet you had to do like a huge HTA on something to just get access to one or two patients. And Peter, you alluded to that too. It's the if. This does not have to be a matter of course. For some things are so rare that it's, do you really want to build this infrastructure? Any thoughts on that, Bob?
Yeah, it really becomes problematic. I mean, you look at the investment that's required to build an HTA dossier, go through all the fees and everything when you have 5 patients, 2 patients, 10 patients. So, you just sort of throw it out there and you hope that you get some exceptional access or something like that. Also, when I came in, I inherited a product 100 patients in Canada. It had been under SAP for, more than a dozen years. There's published clinical evidence, unequivocal published clinical evidence on the benefit of this drug. And we still had to go through CADIF and everything when we brought it to market. And the physician didn't even want us to get a notice of compliance. They were happy leaving well enough alone. They were getting it paid for. The drug was working fine. He'd been collecting data for over a decade. So we finally, due to the responsibility we were here in this country now, we took it through Health Canada, took it through CADIF. And, one of the HTA bodies said, well, your evidence isn't very good. And the HTA consultant we worked with said, this is the best evidence I've ever seen. This is the first, how do you come to market with 12 years of data? No other products ever had that. So yet we still got that your data is not very good. We can't really tell long-term if the drug has value. And it was, we were shaking our heads on that. So I think, Sandra, your point about a framework, there has to be some framework, some rules, some way in which we can organize this where it has some teeth, it has some clout. And it's just not at the whim of a decision maker to either poo-poo your data or say, yeah, it's okay. It's just too unpredictable.
Maybe the last word back to Toon. I'm just keeping an eye on the time now because we're almost at time. Toon, there are a few jurisdictions in Europe that have a threshold under which you don't even have to go to an HTA, let alone put in place a managed access program and everything. And that's because of the market size is so small and the prevalence is probably so small. Any reactions to what you've heard from Canada? And I know this is actually part of your remit, being where should Canada go in terms of getting to where you are? Like, if you could do one thing in Canada, what would it be? Having heard this panel and given your experience.
Yeah, I think, and I think Durhan put also a question to that in the chat in terms of what is the right time frame for some of these managed access agreements. And there's obviously the German example that I think we're all very, very familiar with, which is in terms of the AMNOG approach to things and the thresholds with the 50 million at least allows for a fast access. I know that Germany is also looking now at kind of bringing in some real world evidence to kind of bring in that outcomes perspective. But I think that's still very much in Europe a model that a lot of countries have been looking at, because it has been, I think, the benefit of that early patient access that some of the panelists have been putting forward. I think then Durhan mentioned France. Yes, France has also kind of a general framework with the ATU one, which has its benefit. But I think I would come back to some of the examples that I referred to in terms of that are really specific for orphans, specifically designed and given extra incentive, such as the one in the Netherlands or the one in Scotland, where you have clearly established criteria, where there is kind of that time frame, whether it's 2-3 years. I mean, depending on the jurisdiction, you kind of collect the data and then you reevaluate. I think these are some of risk sharing models that we should look at closer at and see how they can be giving the right incentives to those kind of very small patient populations that I heard mentioned here as part of the debate.
Excellent, thanks. Durhan, you're back on screen. I'd like to thank the panel. I know a couple of you are hopefully going to stick around for panel 3. Toon, that was a fantastic, quick overview. I hope you can stay in touch, and because I think that there was a lot to unpack in your deck that you didn't get to, but you've left us with a lot of food for thought. And once again, thanks to the panel. Back to you, Durhan, for panel 2.
Thank you very, very much. And huge thanks to our panel. I'm actually hoping that some of the people on this panel can actually stay around and we'll take part in panel 2 as well. And Leanne, I don't know if you have to scoot off, but if you can, when we talk about real world evidence, it would be so brilliant to have you directly involved as well. But every one of the members on the panel, do feel free to come back in. So yeah, I'm going to ask those who are formally invited on panel 2 to turn on their cameras. And I'm going to do a very quick intro because we're going to move directly into talking about picking up. I mean, this will be a seamless, I think, a transition in terms of discussion, because as you've talked about, managed access, managed entry, and as Toon has set up for us brilliantly, really does rely on, access to real world evidence. And I'm hoping I can pick up on some of the questions that I was dying to ask even as it was going on in that first panel. So let me just quickly introduce the panel that we've got formally queued up for panel 2. And again, a really great lineup here. Deborah Marshall, who is a long-term colleague, and Deborah knows one of my favorite people in the in this space, and I've known her in so many different kinds of roles, but she is the Arthur J.E. Child Chair of the Rheumatology Outcomes Research, which is pretty impressive. But she's also, I see her as much on our international meetings as I do in Canada. She is certainly an active member of ISPAR, has been an active member of HTAI, and she's done some of the most amazing work that we've seen in terms of patient preferences and also in terms of care pathways. So delighted that Deborah was able to join us. We also have Allison Wills, who is a very interesting title, specialty pharmacy consultant and industry commentator. But I really like the little subphrase that was in her bio. It says, Allison thrives on bringing clarity to complex situations, maximizing commercial opportunities and driving innovation within the Canadian specialty pharmaceutical industry to the benefit of patients. I mean, that is a hefty moniker. So we are really thrilled to have you here and really happy to have you kind of lend that expertise here and hopefully be able to take more advantage of your work there. Aaron Leipzig is the co-founder and CEO of Pentavir, and he's got a long-term career in organizational transformation and analytics, operations funding. It's a very different kind of a perspective bringing in, but I had the great opportunity to hear Aaron and Chris, his, I guess his medical specialist, provide a real live, I guess, demonstration of the work that he's doing in terms of bringing AI into real world evidence, real world data. So thank you so much, Aaron, for joining us here. And hopefully, again, as we say, we'll have much more opportunities to have you engage with us further down the road. Laurie Lambert is here with Caddis and is the lead on real world evidence. Previous to that, Laurie was with Inez. So she brings to us a very interesting kind of broad perspective. So we're really thrilled, and thank you so very much, Laurie, for agreeing to join this panel. And then last, at least that I know for sure, Fred Little. Fred, I think, as Bill alluded to previously, has been a long-term participant in many of the things that we're doing. So Fred is, in fact, the Pfizer country lead for rare diseases. So we are so really delighted that, Fred, you continue to be able to bring a lot of the work that you're doing here. So really welcome to the panel. And maybe without much further ado, I'm going to ask you to kind of come back to, I think, the big questions that we have been asking in terms of, how does it work in terms of the real world evidence in Canada? Where are we? I mean, I think you've heard the importance of it in terms of a part of managed access programs. Where are we in terms of the reality of being able to collect and to actually use real world evidence? And maybe I may actually start with Leanne, because this was something I was dying to ask in the other one. What would it take? I mean, Peter talked about the setup in the with the Fabry's initiative, and we knew it. There was a fair amount of monies and work to set up the collection at the various sites. Are we adequately resourced here in Canada to be able to do the collection and then the analysis of real world evidence, especially for rare diseases?
Well, I think that we have a lot of positives in Canada, but of course, there's always room for expansion. I think in the rare disease setting, you want your real world evidence to be collected by individuals with expertise in the underlying disease, and they tend to be based at certain specific centers, which can be challenging for patients who live some distance. But I think that would be a good place to start, is in the centers of excellence, and then over time, see how that can be branched out. What I really like about this notion of real world evidence, apart from what we've been talking about already, just to gather the data that's necessary to understand how patients respond over the longer term, is that we can also help clinicians understand how best to administer the medication. So understand that once a patient has access to a drug, they're cared for by a physician who may or may not have been involved in the clinical trials. That physician is then responsible for giving a brand new drug to a patient with a complex, rare underlying disease. And so if you have an infrastructure set up that targets specific outcomes at specific timelines, you are teaching physicians in a way how to administer that drug and how it should be monitored. So I see it as a really a multifaceted approach that can have major benefit. But to speak specifically to your question, I mean, I think we have to increase capacity for the care of patients living with rare diseases to ultimately do an optimal job of collecting real world data. I think we have the potential. I think we have a good framework to start. And then I think over time that could grow, and, you know, with additional resources to support the kinds of tests and monitoring that's needed to collect that data.
Thank you very much. And I know that, as you say, the opportunity to improve patient care as part of it is really integral. So let me ping over to Deborah. I'm going to, you know, you sit in a very favorite spot because you're at the university, you do the academics, but you also have a lot of international connections on it. You have one foot in both, you know, practical applications, but also in the research world. Where are we in Canada if we say that, you know, a real cornerstone of being able to bring in managed access, managed entry programs, and maybe to do some of the things that Leanne's talking about? Where are we, and what would it take for us to really be able to you know, implement real world evidence to the level where it's going to be useful for us?
Yeah, thank you, Johan, and thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to this. I'm going to take a little bit of a different lens just to see if we can generate some ideas, but I guess the short answer to that is we're not where we would like or need to be, but that's a little bit of a non-content response. But I think that the key things for me, it was mentioned at the very beginning, is having the infrastructure and having the infrastructure to share data in a secure and appropriate way, you know, with all the privacy considerations, as well as having the needed data. And in the last session, there was some nice discussion around the idea of, you know, essentially looking at value. And Durhane, you know, that one of my passions is engaging patients and also looking at patient preferences. I actually left a conference we were just at virtually right now, which is all about, you know, value and how do we measure value to patients. And it goes beyond just looking at the outcomes. That's necessary, absolutely foundational, but there's also the non-health outcomes. And we sometimes call them process measure. I'm a health economist, so that's how we look at it. But I think having this broad lens becomes very important in terms of being able to get the right information to enable the programs that you're talking about, Durhane. And I guess I'll just say a couple of things in terms of one of the ways to potentially think about this, and I know this is around therapeutics, but is to leverage the diagnostic side, because that's when patients start, right? i.e. they get diagnosed. And we have some nice, I think, databases, infrastructure in rare disease. I know somebody's here from CHIO, or they were in the last session, where we have a national and international platform for diagnosing rare disease. So I belong as the health economist on a program called SOLVE, which is for rare diseases. And we've been able to manage and identify platforms for sharing data. In fact, with the World Economic Forum, we also recently published a framework around federated databases. So if you think about this as a step in terms of diagnosing, my little puny brain says, well, diagnosis is linked to therapy. So then let's link in and leverage those things for the therapeutic side instead of completely reinventing it. And you're also getting people early. So maybe this is a way to conceptualize and think about it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to not go directly to Leanne, but hopefully I can circle back on this because I love to hear her perspective, because I know this is very much, what they're trying to do in their clinics. But maybe I'll pivot over to Allison. And, you work in a somewhat different sector. You have been very much involved in setting up specialty databases in terms of patient data. Can you explain to us how you see that actually fitting into the ability to get access to therapies in a much more managed way for patients, maybe faster, better? Can you explain to us kind of where you see it in terms of some of the patient data collection that you're involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. There is such a unique opportunity in Canada because of the infrastructure that Sandra alluded to earlier, this patient support programs, and truly every specialty drug, every rare disease drug has one of these programs in place. And in the absence of a formalized national framework to systematically collect health outcomes data, which I think all of you are working towards, or we're all working towards, PSPs are really a great avenue to start collecting outcomes data and get experience doing so. And that can enable quicker patient access. It would be great to have a national infrastructure in place already, but it's curious, like in Canada, we have PSPs in place and we have the infrastructure to do so. I see it as really a great starting point or a place to develop further for many organizations who have already been collecting data with their PSPs, use those learnings and then roll that experience into more of a national approach, down the line. Looking at managed agreements and outcomes-based agreements and rare disease and PSPs, these things are intertwined and they actually connect really, really well. A couple of key factors to get managed entry agreements or OBAs starting to work is collecting the data. So if PSPs are positioned to do that for rare disease, a couple of reasons why: a limited number of patients, limited number of prescribers or physicians. And that means that the data and the amount of data being collected, it doesn't have to be so huge. It's going to be limited. The process to collect data via the PSP would likely at this point be something more of a manual type data collection than what we've seen using administrative databases. And I think for OBAs, that would actually be a good thing. It allows flexibility that can be tailored to the needs of an outcomes-based agreement data collection program. So imagine you have all the stakeholders at the table defining upfront in that agreement what type of data is required, particularly having the payer at the table to say we need X, Y, and Z data sets, and these are the protocols that we want around that. And that can be done with that patient support program infrastructure. It's really a well-suited mechanisms to support OBAs, and particularly for rare disease drugs and for rare disease patients. The infrastructure is there, and they really check the boxes from on a lot of points that are required to support these types of agreements.
So Allison, these patient support programs, and are they set up to be for both? We have obviously in Canada a huge number, and majority of our patients actually do have private insurance, and a lot of these patient support programs are also specialty drugs, as you say. Are you also tracking both the public pay and the private pay patients? Is this irregardless of kind of who the payer is?
Yeah, PSPs are tracking the patient. So each patient would have that unique situation for them, public, private, and multiple pairs, I suppose. But yeah, they would be tracking. I see an outcomes-based agreement type model or program via PSP that really would have to be a separate discussion versus what's already happening today. So in their origins years ago, PSPs and today are really set up for that, the access part. And now I've seen many organizations here in Canada moving towards that mindset that they're going to use the infrastructure and investment that they've made in the patient support program to start collecting data. And I think the piece that, maybe a barrier or a challenge that we need to overcome is that the formalized data collection. So there's a lot of data that's been collected to date, and I'm seeing organizations really making moves to go, okay, we want to put a formalized data collection program in place and be able to use that to start having discussions with HTA, with payers, and then moving the needle on these types of managed entry agreements, or getting the product covered, collecting data, and then be able to support discussions later.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think, in Canada, we have the opportunity because we've got so many models. I mean, maybe, we can talk about, as we said, how did they come together? So Fred, if you don't mind, I'll pivot to you and just give us your thoughts from an industry point of view. I mean, you folks are, when we talk about these patient support programs, a lot of them are directly set up, through industry contracts in terms of supporting the patients beyond just collecting the data. Where do you see this going, and how do you see some of these initiatives really supporting, for me, this whole notion of how do we get, better information that can inform us in terms of the actual access to these therapies?
Yeah, great question, Durhan. I could probably write a book just with that question alone. So let's tackle patient support programs. So I think, first of all, they're a great initiative for patients to be able to get and have navigation services to get access to medications. I mean, it's a necessary part of the Canadian system, because if we look at diseases in rare disease or in rheumatology or in oncology, are exceptional. So by definition, there's certain criteria, and the clinician, have a lot on their hands, and the last thing they have is to do paperwork at the end of the day. So they have to do some work, but also having the patient support program to help supplement, to get patients on the therapy as quickly as possible, and also to do any sort of financial navigation that's required. So it is something that, if you're coming into this field, you have to be able to understand and be able to put in place. And I think many of the other speakers have spoke to that. The second part, though, is around where it's going. And I think there's two elements. The first part of the element is, I think there's willingness. There's willingness someone on the payer, there's willingness on the manufacturer, patients, clinicians, to put programs in place to be able to, through real world data, whether it's risk sharing or managed access, whatever that is. The problem that we fall into is, once you get into negotiations, it's just so much easier to fall back to price volume, because as you're going through agreements, when you get in and you're trying to negotiate, what is the efficacy point that you can measure? So if it's one that's symptomatic, it may be easier, but what if it's mortality? It's a little bit more difficult, and you got to wait over time. So I think, people talked about starting early, and this concept of, zero, time zero reimbursement, right, where we work. So these are sort of concepts like Germany that was talked about previously. And then the third element, and I don't know if Dr. Marshall remembers me, but going back to the rheumatology days, they tried this, and I mean, I suppose the first concept was around registries, with whether it was BioTrack or OBRI, where you have outcomes that really show that biologics actually have the outcome measures that they said originally that they needed. But it was looking at prospectively over time and looking at large cohorts. And I mean, you could do that in rare disease, but as you know, it's a lot smaller than what you do in the rheumatology field. But the other element to that, I think, which is important, is the actual, collection of data. So even when you look at registry, physicians continue, and I think you'll hear this, duplication, right? So when you, at the point of patient, you're collecting data. Then at the point of patient, you may be entering into an EMR or into a hospital EMR. And then at the end of the day, if you're part of a registry, now you've got to enter almost sometimes the same data into another database. So I think was Dr. Marshall talked about federation. What was it? Federation of databases. So we are in a federation in Canada, but the healthcare system is provincial and actually even hospital affiliated, and linkage is not always easy. So look, that's why I say you can write a book. There's so many parts that try and get seamlessness. The best thing we have is we have willing partners. Then over time, with investment, can we get to an infrastructure that will allow for easier and facilitated access, then can get to these agreements for at the end of the day, the benefit of patients. So I'll stop there, because again, we could go on, but these are some of the opportunities, but also challenges that we face.
Those were amazingly, cogent points, Fred. And as you were speaking, I kept thinking, like, where to go with it next. And every time you said something different, I thought about a different direction. So maybe you should write a book at some point, but don't do it until you afterwards, because we need you too much in terms of helping to move through therapies here. I'm going to actually ping over to Aaron then before I come back to Laurie, because I'd love to hear where Kadith is going to go with all of this. But Aaron, maybe you can introduce a bit of what you folks do and how you see, the kind of services that you can provide, kind of running a thread through what you've been hearing about the collection and analysis of real world data and the different sources of it.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for including me on this panel. So just very quickly, Pentavir is a digital AI company. And the problem that we solve is the problem that, we're talking about data. We still manually go through electronic health records to get at the data that we need. We talk about federated models, which is an incredibly scalable solution given GDPR and Canadian privacy governance legislation. But the data we need to populate those federated models, or the data that researchers need to go in and understand, especially as it pertains to outcomes, as it pertains to treatments patterns, as it pertains to who these patients are from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, that data is not easily accessible and easily meaningful. And we've developed solutions that really focused on the curation at scale of clinical features from unstructured documentation. And just to build upon what everybody's saying in terms of where are we going, what place can technology play in getting us to the place that we need to be? And if you think about technology as a tool or a set of tools that delivers a function to solve a problem, I think we're ahead of our skis in terms of where technology is at. Whether it's AI, natural language processing, homomorphic encryption, blockchain, we have the tools we need to be able to really solve some of the problems. It's about the governance and the design around how are we going to solve these problems. So again, we did a project with one of our customers with their patient support program. It was Canadian based, but it was the first time globally that this customer was actually able to curate information out of their patient support program where the endpoints were statistically meaningful and publishable to the point we got an oral presentation. Now, it wasn't necessarily a technological solution, but it was saying, how do we consent? How are we designing it so the data that we curate can be used? And if you take a step back, and we all recognize that over 80% of the health information we create today still isn't used at scale to improve health outcomes. We know that from the work we do in oncology, but so much more so in rare diseases where we are looking for those needles in haystacks. If you take a step back, how do we design the governance, the consent, with all of the great literature that is out there, and design programs that can unleash the power of technology? And when we've designed towards that end, in that sequence, we've actually been able to achieve things that people thought weren't possible, from a privacy officer of a health authority allowing agreements where data can be curated at scale and shared with third-party entities in an appropriate way, which were pharmaceutical companies, where that data can become a data set that they own, that they can use. But it all stands back to the authorities and the principles, and not being afraid of them, but embracing them, because regulators, the folks we've spoken to at Health Canada, want to get to this destination as well, because at the end of the day, patients benefit, patients are waiting, and better for outcomes of patients helps us all.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. I'm going to have to kind of really, I think, bring everybody back together where we can take all the gems that you've been talking about in terms of opportunities and force you to put them together in terms of a puzzle, that can come up with a solution. So I'm going to pivot to you, Laurie. You get the last word on this panel. Where is Kadith in this? How is Kadith going to be able then to use that real world evidence in the recommendations you're making? Because I know you're making a big step from just the kinds of work that you're doing in terms of your recommendations. And I know they've brought you in specifically to help design this. So over to you.
Yeah, so I guess a few messages that I wanted to say was that just to let people know, so I've been hired, I'm 100% dedicated to developing the use of real world evidence at CADIS. For 16 years at INES, that's all I did was real world evidence projects. And so just to let everyone know that's talking, everything that you're talking about, I've experienced, I've had to do it. I know the challenges, I know what works, I know what doesn't work in all that time. And what you're saying, I'm in total agreement and alignment with. And CADIS is open for business. We have a new CEO, we have a new vice president of evidence standards. We have me, so just to say that there really is, we're ready to go. We want to move in this area. We're in contact with RWE for decisions. We're telling them we're an active player in all this. And the way that we see it is that CADIS has, you know, we can be like just the coordinator, right? It's not that we're going to generate the evidence, but we'll know what, you know, what evidence do we need, did the decision makers need? So we see our main role is going to be the link between Health Canada. You know, we have the public health payers are already meeting at CADIS regularly. So we see ourselves really as the hub of, a bit like the slide at the beginning. We have links to patient organizations, all the links. So we see our role, let's try and coordinate it, because I think Canada does have, we have the ability, you know, we have the infrastructure. It's just trying to pull it all together. And so that's what we see our main role as doing. So just say, I'm open to, you know, emails, meetings, so on, of moving this forward. We've already met with Durhan once, and we want to do real world evidence in a bigger way. I was very involved in devices, but rare disease is obviously the place, is a really good place to start. As Leanne said, it's smaller numbers actually makes it easier. Like I did an evaluation with 80 hospitals, you know, so to work with 10 hospitals across Canada, it just makes it that much easier. So, and the other thing that I feel like people like HTA, that, you know, there's a publication this year of health technology assessment, is Health Canada is going to look at the benefit risk ratio, but the job of CADIS is this going to be effective in the real world? And right, and what are the resources that it's going to take? What are the implementation issues? So that's the role of CADIS, and real world evidence can help, right, to fill in all those gaps. So I really, you know, I've been very analyzed the trust for RD and the real world evidence for decisions. It really fits with the experience that I've had. I totally believe it's the way to go. So just to say, you know, we can't solve all the problems now, but just to say we're very much open for business in this area, and very, very keen to move forward, and I'll be working very hard to do so.
Well,
And that's what
really,
I told Cadith in the interview, that
yeah.
I only wanted to leave if I knew that we could make things happen. So just to say, that's very much, you know, my goal.
Well, we look forward to it. We're glad you make the big, bold statements in terms of where you see CADIS going and what the role is going to be. I need to wrap it up because we do want to have an opportunity to talk about the drug access navigators that Bill's going to take us through, but hopefully everybody can stay on. We can still have that kind of expanded discussion. Huge thanks to everybody here. This was such an amazing opportunity. And I really am sincere. I'm hoping that we can bring people back together and have a real problem solving session. Bill and I were talking earlier, along with some others, that we'd love to do some pilots, you know, this summer, really set up, you know, not do the pilots, but set it up. We feel the way to kick off the rare drug strategy is to really work in real time with real products that are coming in. And certainly the core of that is going to be looking at the managed access real world. So I'm hoping we can bring all of you, entice you back to continue to work with us as we're setting these up. So thanks to everybody here. And Bill, I'm going to punt it back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Durhan, and thanks for leading that that last panel. It was excellent. This webinar, we wanted to look at managed access programs, real world evidence development, really, the whole idea is around how to get earlier and better access to medicines that will help Canadians, especially Canadians with rare disorders. And I think that we've made huge progress with the previous two panels in terms of setting up some of the systems and policies and the tough conversations that still have to happen. But today in the real world, there may be some lessons from the cancer world that the rare disease community could potentially benefit from. So that's where Durhan and I were talking about, who could we talk to? And there's this, not so well known, but incredibly important profession within the oncology and the cancer community called the DANs. And no, they're not all named Dan. In fact, the one that we have here is named Alan, but it stands for the Drug Access Navigators. So, Alan, I'm not going to waste any more time. I want to turn it over to you. Right now, you're manager for patient and community solutions at Centrix Health Solutions, but very recently you were at North York Gen as the Dan there. So would you mind walking through, the Dan role for oncology, and then, what are some thoughts about how this could actually work for the rare disease group? And, everyone on the line now, contribute to the chat and be ready to put your hand up. I know Dr. Greenberg just joined, which is great, and Dr. Ward is still there, and Sandra may contribute as well. So Alan, a few words on you and the DANs.
Sure, thank you, Bill. Thanks, Durhan and Cord and everyone. So just to elaborate a bit, the role of the Drug Access Navigator has been in oncology for probably 15 years or so. And our role is really to act as a bridge between payers and the patient and the clinicians. So what would happen is the physician will say, I need this particular medication for my patient. How do we do it? What's required? So then my function would be to explore options to see how we can get this medication for the patient. Is it going to be through private insurance? Is it covered by the province? Is it an SAP drug through Health Canada? Is there a managed access program through a PSP? What options are there? Or is it going to be a mixture of them? When it comes to these patient support programs, they'll typically pick up whatever is not covered by the payer. So we can leverage a whole bunch of different mechanisms all combined to make sure that a patient can get their therapy quickly, ideally not paying anything for it if possible. And that's kind of what our core function is. So we're pretty much the bridge between, how to get these things for the patient. We kind of guide them and try to explore whatever options are out there and connect them with things that they may not be able to find otherwise, or that an oncologist or hematologist might not know is available. In oncology alone, we probably have about 55 different patient support programs. So there's a lot of different areas to explore. They are all run a little bit differently, and they have different drugs that they cover. So to expect that a newly diagnosed patient, for example, would be able to do any of these things on their own is just, it's such a burden to be able to go through the paperwork that is required to get some of these medications approved, for example, just by a private insurance company. So we try to take all of that off of the patient so that they can concentrate just on the fact that they've been diagnosed with cancer and dealing with the realities of that instead.
Thanks so much, Alan. I know, Dr. Greenberg, I don't know if you've got your camera on or the mic open. Let's do good.
Hold on a second.
Well, while we're waiting for, oh, there we go. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining. I know you've caught the last little bit, and for the benefit of the community, a lot of people know you. You've been on Cord seminars many times, but the other panelists were introduced. You want to just give us a quick lowdown of, I guess you're in Winnipeg, lots of certificates behind you that say that you're the best metabolic disorders clinician in Canada or something. Give us the quick.
Don't say that. Don't say that. There's probably lots of other metabolic clinicians on the webinar, Well, I certainly, I don't want to compete or even compare myself to Dr. Ward for sure. I may be the oldest, but um, obviously it's a small metabolic community across Canada. So we all know each other, and I'm the clinician and the doctor for ultra rare inborn errors of metabolism. So although there are many, many, many different rare disorders, they're not all quote metabolic or single gene genetic disorders. So I just want to differentiate. What I try to help my patients get access to the new and approved drugs for rare inborn errors of metabolism. I'm very sorry I missed the previous panels because I did really want to talk about the importance of real world evidence and what we're doing in the metabolic community across Canada to help collect real world evidence and work with researchers to ensure that the real world evidence that they collect is validated and used in any of their submissions and in their clinical trials. But when you come to the drug navigator, in my field of inborn errors metabolism, although they play the role in many different aspects related to cancer drugs, so many of our drugs for rare inborn errors are still in the clinical trial stage. And I'm not sure what the role of a navigator is to help patients and become aware of what clinical trials are available, whether or not they would be eligible for clinical trials, and then go from the clinical trial stage, to actually, improve the access to a proven medication that has gone through the clinical trial stage. So from the oncology drug navigation point of view, how many, when the navigator and works with all the possible parties to improve access to oncology drugs, how many of these drugs are still in the clinical trials and not quote approved drugs yet? I'm asking you because I don't know.
It's over to Alan.
Yeah, well, it's a mixture of both what we would typically look at, like whatever, like if a physician would upfront say, I want an X drug, right? So if it is something that's funded, we would explore that, the easiest pathway. But sometimes if there is a patient in a particular situation where they've exhausted all of the funded lines of therapy, then we can look into things like on clinicaltrials.gov and explore their database to see if there is a patient trial that this patient would be eligible for and connect them to that as well. So really, we try to explore any options, any programs, trials, services that are available.
Dr. Ward, just to make sure, in the interest of time, any thoughts on a DAN for rare? Would that be helpful in your clinic?
I mean, I think eventually, I think what you might need to understand about my space is that of all the rare bone diseases that I treat, there's only 2 of them who have health authority approved drug indications. So I've only got 2 drugs to work with. Now that is expanding. So when you think about a navigator, for sure, I think that could be a great facilitator, but it's not like we have a number of different, drugs to choose from. There are increasingly numbers of trials going on in the space. So I can see that as things mature in my particular field, that this could be an incredible enabler. But we're just nowhere near where you are in the cancer world, where you've had trials going on for quite some time. I mean, the first pediatric rare or childhood onset rare bone disease trial, started a little after the turn of the century. So we're really quite, new to this space. But I like the concept of it. And I think that anything that can help facilitate understanding the complexity of what we're dealing with is a positive. And that's one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize in this whole dialogue today, is that what we're dealing with these patients' diseases, with the mechanisms of the drugs, with the outcomes that we need to study is incredibly complex. And so I think the more ways we have of coming at the problem to get a real, fulsome approach is meritorious.
And Dr. Greenberg, on the ground in the clinic, I mean, does that resonate with you as well? I remember I'm just looking at some of the numbers of oncology drugs in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, there were about 20 cancer drugs, and now there's almost 100 available. So you've kind of got that roadmap there, and the GPS is the guider is the DAN. Could you use that roadmap in your clinic, Cheryl?
I mean, when I look at the oncology navigators, I mean, they play an incredible role. What I like about it is that right now, as when I read about the oncology drug navigators, you know, they're, although there isn't a training program or it's not regulated, this group of professionals, they are hired by the hospital, and their sole function is to help the patient navigate to cancer drugs, because the patient comes up, as it does in our field, you know, how am I going to pay for this? So I understand the role, and I understand that they're arm's length from pharma, which is important to me, and are there to speak for the patient and try to identify any possible route to get access to an approved drug. So I see it absolutely important in our field. Right now, within the navigation to access to drugs, it falls on us as doctors to make applications either for special access or for compassionate, or to some of the managed access programs for drugs that are not approved in Canada, but may be approved elsewhere. But as more drugs get approved in Canada, it certainly will help the patient, knowing that there is a central person to whom they could report to and inquire, can you help me find out how to pay for this? I mean, it's definitely would be helpful. Right now, the number of approved drugs is still small, and it falls on us as clinicians to help the patient get access to clinical trials and then go from there. So I mean, I see the clinicians working with drug navigators, whether that, you know, there's a need. I think there really is a need, and I would like to see it hospital-based, or you know, at arm's length, you know, or even, you know, a subgroup of some other existing patient navigators, you know, in the hospital. But I like the concept. You know, they're objective and they're there to help.
Thanks so much, Dr. Greenberg. Durhan put something in the chat, which I thought was interesting. And then maybe that'll be the last word for this, and I'll pass it over to Durhan, because we are at time for this webinar. But Alan, is it always about drugs only? Or, because one thing about rare disorders, it's access to care networks. It's sometimes it's getting a diagnosis. It's a lot more than just the actual medicine. And actually some therapies aren't even medicines. You know, they can actually be food supplements and other things. You know, does a Dan just do the drug access, or do you end up being a coach on other issues as well?
So that's a very good question. So I would say, first of all, in oncology, we are very, very spoiled. We have a navigator who does just reimbursement, but we also have patient navigators who tend to be an RN. And we have this luxury of all sorts of different people to pick from. So there's different people in the circle of care that can help with different functions. So a lot of areas do have these patient navigators who go beyond reimbursement and do connect with all sorts of things like genetic testing, dietitian related activities, any sort of programs, patient groups, like referring someone to CORD, for example. So it depends on what the function would be for the person. But I think the core of the navigator role could be put into rare disease, and you could just customize it to fit your area more. So maybe they need to have more of a focus on trials, more of a focus on support programs, and less so on reimbursement. So I really think that the role belongs there, but you would customize it to suit your needs.
Thanks so much, Alan. And thank you, Dr. Ward and Dr. Greenberg, so much for participating. Durhan, over to you to take us home, and hope to see you all properly soon. We can get beyond these Zooms.
Yes, thank you so very much. And really, I know, Cheryl, you had to rush from whatever else you were doing to jump in here. We always appreciate your taking the time, and Leanne for hanging in there for the entire time. So thank you. Huge thanks to Toon, who I was going to ask him a last question, but we're out of time. So I'm going to follow up with it. Maybe we can engage Toon in the future in terms of our putting forth some of these pilots. It is just delightful. I think, as Laurie says, that Canada definitely is part of UCAN. So there's a great deal that we can do in that collaboration. We don't need to be doing it alone. But I think you also heard that there is an embarrassment of riches in terms of what we have already, in terms of programs, in terms of experience, et cetera. The two big things that we are talking about, people keep saying, you know, what's the government going to use the $500 million a year for in terms of the rare drug strategy? And I say it ain't to pay for drugs. I mean, it can be to pay for some drugs up front and be able to kind of, support the early access and the risk sharing, et cetera. But we really have to invest in what we're talking about here, infrastructure. We really have to invest in terms of building up those clinic networks. We really have to invest in terms of the training. And definitely we want to invest in putting up the systems for the managed access to real world evidence. And as Alan made here a brilliant, kind of a contribution to, we need to have people in those settings that can help in terms of navigate the patients, but also working alongside with the clinicians to make sure that we're able to get that broad access. So lots of things going forward here. Not that anybody's asking me what from Health Canada or from the government, what we want to do with the 500 million. We just keep putting it out there, and hopefully they see, kind of where the community is. So thank you folks so very much. This is such an important activity that we have. 2 weeks from now, we will have our third webinar. And I will say is that third webinar is going to be, how do we make sure we get access to rare disease drugs to come into Canada? And quite frankly, one of the areas we are going to be talking about are some of the concerns we have with the regulatory pricing restrictions that are really having a major impact in terms of companies and their ability to want to invest early in clinical trials and their ability to bring drugs in early into Canada. So we want to come back to that theme. We want to make sure as we're building the system to be able to provide access to rare disease drugs in the best way possible, that we also do have as early an access to these therapies as possible. I think there's nobody but knows better than the clinicians and patients that the timeliness in terms of getting access is such an important a feature of what we want to do. So thanks again, everybody, so very much for participating. Keep watch. We're going to be sending out some information about the next one, which is June 10th. And then right after that, we will have sort of a wrap up in terms of where we're hoping this will be going in terms of the setup for the rare drug strategy on June 17th. So stay tuned. Thank you folks so very much. And we will hopefully see you, sometime in the not too distant future in real life. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.